When I returned to England as a teenager, I think I did lots of the very standard, like, evangelical community things. I got involved with Christian Union at university. I was part of a youth group before that. But I found myself a little bit frustrated at university with the sort of Christian community scene, basically for two reasons. One was that I felt that the entire focus was on evangelism. And I don't know if you guys had similar experiences at your universities and Christian unions. And I thought evangelism was great and really important, but the Christian life was about more than that, and following Jesus was more than just saving souls. And then the second was that obviously at university you're thinking about the rest of your life and your career. And I didn't feel like, at least where I was, the church or the CU had a really clear guidance for what that means. And obviously university is preparation for the entire rest of your life. And I'm sure that being a Christian changes the way you think about your career, but I didn't have super clear guidance on that. So I was involved with setting up two organizations. One of them is this one, Christians for Impact, which obviously does look at the career question. And the other is an organization called Just Love, which some of you may have come across, which is a student Christian social activism organization focused on social justice. But as I got more involved in the sort of charity social action space, again, I found myself frustrated. I don't want to sound like too much of a dissenter, but one thing that I felt and others around me felt was that it was really hard to know like which issues to prioritize, and there's so much good you can do in the world, there's so much that's wrong in the world that needs fixing, and we were very enthusiastic young Christians. You know, we wanted to like focus on local homelessness, and we wanted to look at human trafficking and climate change around the world and like global poverty, but we were only a small group of people. We didn't really have any money or power or resources, and so we had to like really think which issues we're going to focus on. And I was a little bit frustrated that the charity world in general didn't seem to do this lots in terms of thinking really carefully about where should we spend our very precious resources and what has the most impact. And obviously through that I encountered effective altruism. I guess we'll come on to the politics stuff more later, but I've always been interested in politics and policy, so in some ways it's a very natural trajectory. I'm pretty convinced about that being an area where one can have a big impact, so I think that meeting of like, yeah, this is something I'm passionate about and feels fun and exciting, but also I'm like pretty intellectually convinced this is impactful. That's kind of all that was needed really to get me into politics in the first place.
It's lovely hearing about how your upbringing and just like thoughts have changed over time, and I was on Just Love committee in Cambridge, so it's lovely to know you were involved in setting that up. So you've shared how you've thought about getting to where you are now. What's your day-to-day like currently running a think tank and having campaigned as an MP previously?
So yeah, it's a good question, not least because I think think tanks are very weird organizations, and I think my parents don't really believe that I have a real job, because it's kind of like you're paid to just think, which is basically what we do. But essentially, if you imagine policymaking as like a bit of a spectrum where on one end you've got like the government, which literally does stuff in people's lives, like it makes laws, but it also provides services, you know, healthcare, education, whatever. And then at the other end, you've got like academia, which, yeah, I presume most of you have been to university, you'll have some sense of what that looks like. And so academia is like researching big problems and ideas, and at its best, it's sort of, you know, making discoveries and insights. And then policy over here, government is like trying to do stuff in the real world. And then there's this kind of gap in between, and think tanks are essentially trying to fill that gap. So what we're trying to do is use the research and the evidence that's out there and the insights that academics and researchers have, but rather than just, you know, have it in journals or in academic seminars, translate that into actual policy design that policymakers can actually use. So probably best to use an example. So one thing that we're doing at the moment in my think tank is we're helping the government design what they call AI growth zones. So these are parts of the country where they want to build data centers to take advantages of opportunities from AI. They want to do that in a safe way, or we're trying to make sure they do it in a safe way. They want to do it in a way that benefits local communities. And they announced it at the start of the year. The Prime Minister stood up and said, we're going to do AI growth zones. But no one knew what an AI growth zone was. He didn't know what an AI growth zone was. It was just a thing that they come up with. So then you need civil servants and think tanks and different groups in that space to help flesh out those ideas. And so what we'll do is we'll go to the government with various options that we've researched. We'll speak to economists, we'll speak to people in the industry to try and design that policy. So day to day, it looks a little bit weird, and some of the stuff doesn't look like real job stuff. So there's a lot of what I would call like trying to gauge policy demand from government. Sorry, do you mind if I switch that music off?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, it's very quiet, random like music in the background. So yeah, one thing I'm trying to do day to day is like understand what policymakers actually want from us. So there's no price signal in the think tank sector, right? So it's not like you're, a supermarket providing food and you're trying to work out how much is something to provide, and you can look at like what things are selling and you can adjust prices or adjust supply accordingly. It's more like we're just speaking to people in government, civil servants, special advisors, politicians, trying to get a sense of like, where is the policy demand right now? What are the issues that the government's looking into? Where can we fill a gap? Where is the civil service like not able to fully provide what's needed? And then I would take that back to my team and my researchers and say, look, this is what we're getting from government. Like, what are the gaps that we think we can fill? Like, what do we think the correct policy solution is here? And like, what do we need to produce? Is it like, a think tank report that outlines what you need to do? Do we need to like get some people together in a room? Is it more campaigny or something in the media? And then we'll go away and do that. But what that looks like in practice can be really like tomorrow I've got a dinner, which will be quite nice and quite fun, but is genuinely work, which is with a load of Labour people who want to build loads of housing. A lot of it's like just generally loitering around Westminster, trying to catch people's attention as well.
It's interesting to hear what you're currently working on with the AI safety zones, but having been in this space for quite a while, can you give any examples that show how much impact you think someone could have within policy?
Yeah, so in general, I think our default assumption should be that politics is quite impactful. Now, obviously, I'm biased because I work in politics, but I presume you've all had that experience of looking at the world, reading the news, and looking at all its problems and just being like, oh man, who's in charge? Like, who allowed this to happen? How do we stop it? Or how do we make better stuff happen? And yeah, without wanting to oversimplify the way the world works, like there are people in charge. There are politicians, there are governments. They don't control everything, but they do have a lot of power. And so I think our starting point should be that politics is probably quite an impactful place to work. And obviously in a liberal democracy, you get a vote, so everyone has some degree of political power if you live in a democracy. But you can just have vastly more by getting involved in the system, either by trying to become one of the elected representatives who makes decisions or working for them, or doing the sort of weird job that I do, which is like designing policies which they might then implement. So yeah, I think the base case should be that politics is probably impactful, but to give some more like tangible examples, I did write some down on my phone. So I remember when I was working in Parliament, so I was like 23 or 22, so really early career, like just out of university basically. One day there was a vote on whether the UK should renew Trident, which is the UK's nuclear submarine defence system. So the UK is one of like, less than 10 countries in the world which has nuclear weapons. And so this is pretty important. And the MP that I worked for came into the office that morning and was like, so David, Trident, what do you think? For, against, abstain? And I was like, okay, give me like a couple of hours to do some research into like what I actually think about Trident. And on that kind of issue, every MP has a free vote. So it wasn't like, he had as much power as the Prime Minister on that particular day, on that particular vote. There are other issues like that. I was also working in Parliament around the time of Brexit, and so there were lots of things where individual MPs could like really shape the course of our future relationship with the EU. Similarly, MPs are currently debating a bill on assisted dying, and that will be a free vote. And so, if you're working for an MP and they're not sure what to do, or if you are an MP, you have a huge amount of impact over potentially a really, really important issue. Some examples not from my life, but I think are really good examples of impact are, so on artificial intelligence, which I know is something lots of you guys will be concerned about, the UK was the first country to organise a global summit and like get countries together, and they drafted the Bletchley AI Accord, which was then signed by a bunch of countries, including the US and China, which was really quite a milestone. And it's just hard to see how that would happen without political engagement. So policy is like clearly impactful there. There are other examples I could give, but let's leave it there for now.
Thank you for the examples you gave there. You gave a variety linking to different problem areas. Are there particular issues which you think are most tractable via policy?
So I think one way of thinking about this is that politics is fundamentally trying to solve a coordination problem. So the most tractable issues are going to be the ones where it's stuff that everyone kind of agrees would be better, but you need someone centrally to say, hey, we're going to do this, and this is either the law or it's at least like the norm. So one issue might be something like animal welfare regulation, which some of you work on. And I think most farmers don't enjoy torturing animals, we hope. Like they would probably prefer it if they could make a living without horrific amounts of cruelty towards animals. Most consumers would rather eat meat that isn't tortured. So it feels like there's a bit of a coordination problem here because farmers don't find it affordable to have really high welfare standards, and consumers don't find it affordable either. But if the government were to step in and just say, hey, these are the standards that everyone has to abide by, then no individual farmer is going to lose out from doing that. So there's kind of a coordination issue. Now, I'm slightly oversimplifying here because meat always has to compete with other foods, and UK farmers have to compete with farmers abroad, so there is always this competitive dynamic, which means people will benefit from lower standards. But I think there's lots of areas where the government can just play this really useful coordinating role, which is kind of stuff that everyone can get behind. And that's the most tractable stuff, because you can just point out, hey, this is something everyone wants, we just need someone to step in. And a lot of regulation, particularly health and safety type stuff, I think is within that space of coordination. The second most tractable bucket of policies, I would say, is stuff where the benefits are really concentrated.
Now battery, please charge.
The benefits are really, is that my mic that's going to go? We'll find out. The benefits are really concentrated, but the costs are really diffuse. And so if there's a small group that stands to gain a lot from something and the general cost of society is really small, I actually think that's a really tractable area. And that might be a bit counterintuitive because we live in a democracy. So you might expect actually the majorities are always going to be the ones that win out and small groups can't. But the way our voting system and the way elections actually work is that politicians will always try and pick up extra votes from additional groups. So if you're a small, well-organized group that has a really clear ask that doesn't impose much cost on wider society, then I think it's actually quite easy to organize those people, make the case to policymakers. Because from a politician's perspective, it's hey, this group, this is their most important thing, and I can win their vote by just doing this thing. And it's not the most important thing for everyone else, so I'm not going to lose much support by doing that. So an example might be something it might sound a bit trivial or random, but making buildings wheelchair accessible. It's very minimal cost on most people, right? Buildings have to put in some extra stuff to make it wheelchair accessible, but huge benefits to people who are in wheelchairs. So even though they're a really small minority of the population, basically every building in public building in the West kind of has to have wheelchair access now. And I think a lot of health and safety regulation is in that category. But that leads me to the flip side, which is that if the benefits are really diffuse and the costs are really specific to one group, it's actually really hard to get regulatory change, and those issues are really intractable. Those also happen to be the issues that I'm trying to work on. So maybe those are not, maybe I should choose a more tractable area. But so one example would be housing. So building new housing somewhere is generally good for the population at large because it reduces the cost of housing, but it's rarely benefiting one specific group. Most of us, we could live in a huge variety of places, right? We're not we have to live in that community. But it really imposes costs for the existing people living there because they suddenly have to deal with building around them. So then you get this sort of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, which would kind of be fine if it was just one place, but the problem is everywhere is someone's backyard. So then you get NIMBYism across the country where there's lots of focused costs, and the benefit would be great for the population as a whole if we built more housing, but it doesn't happen. So that happens to be one of the issues I'm working on. I think it's really intractable as well. Just one more weird thing I'd say on this is that obviously the most tractable things have probably been done already that are really good. So you might find yourself working on a more intractable thing, but I still think politics as a whole is a really tractable lever compared to some other stuff. So even if something's intractable within politics, it doesn't mean it's not worth working on.
It's been nice getting into the specific details of policy and its particular impacts. Now we've looked at that, how do you think civil service politics and party roles compare for longer term impact?
I'm probably not the best person to judge this. I've not worked in the civil service. My instinct is to say something like the variance is higher in politics. So if you're the most impactful politician is probably more impactful than the most impactful civil servant. Like, that seems kind of obvious. Like, the Prime Minister is literally the person who makes final decisions. And if you look at like people who've shaped history, and I guess in the most public obvious ways, it tends to be like politicians rather than civil servants, though, yeah, maybe there's stuff happening behind the scenes that we don't notice. But politics feels a little bit higher risk in that, yeah, like elections, just really clear example of that. Like, you either win or you lose, whereas civil servants keep their jobs throughout elections. So I would really struggle to put to say which one is better as like the median or mean option. I suppose one thing I would say is that I actually think the election, the sort of high variance nature of politics is quite helpful. Okay, I think there's like a germ of a point here, but I haven't thought through it really well, so do challenge me on it afterwards. But I think a lot of stuff in life is high variance in terms of impact, but it doesn't look high variance because you're allowed, like everyone's just allowed to continue. So I think a lot of charities are like a little bit rubbish, but they kind of still get donations and they can still carry on. Like, there's no election at the end of the year where we like vote in the best charity and then they get to have all the impact. Like, everyone's just allowed to kind of tick along. And so it could look like, hey, charities are like a better bet than going into politics because I'm not going to lose my job, and like there's no like big sorting mechanism at the end of the year. But actually maybe you want that sorting mechanism, or you want to have that like high competitive pressure in order to filter out the really like impactful stuff from the less impactful stuff. So it's possible, this is like an unthought through thesis, that like your average civil servant is like not very impactful because it's just too easy to like remain a civil servant and no one's going to fire you. It's, you just get moved around. There's like, civil servants decide their own budgets and pay a lot of the time. So it's like, it's a difficult industry to like lose at, whereas politics is really easy to lose at, but maybe that's actually a good thing in some ways. The other thing I would say is that if you're thinking about your own careers, I would just go with, like say you're interested in either civil service or politics, I would really think about your own personal fit for those, because I think they both have really plausible stories for impact, and I can point to extremely impactful civil servants and extremely impactful politicians. And I think most people, like after looking into it for a bit, and especially after trying it for a bit, will probably have a reasonably good sense of where they'll feel like they're a better fit. I could not be a civil servant. I would find it extremely frustrating. I hate bureaucracies. I'm not very good with rules. I'm not very good with hierarchy. Politics is far, far better for me. I know a lot of people who are the exact opposite. So yeah, if you're interested in the two, like I would just look at personal fit rather than potential impact.
It's lovely hearing about how you found something that works for you, and I'd also never thought about assessing impact in that way before. Have there been times that you've got something wrong in policy, and how have you been able to course correct? Because obviously the stakes are quite high.
Yeah, there definitely have been. So one thing that's quite funny is that my first job out of university, like before I was working for the MP, was actually, I really needed a job, and I knew a bunch of Christians who were running something called the Keep Sunday Special campaign, and they needed someone to like run their like parliamentary engagement, and this felt like a good opportunity for me. I didn't really, just to be clear, I should explain, the campaign was to keep Sunday trading laws in the UK. So basically, as you'll probably notice, if you tried to go to a shop today, a big shop, it'll be closed for a larger chunk of the day than on other days. And the Cameron government was trying to stop this. And lots of churches were concerned because they thought like Sunday should be kept sacred in some way. Lots of trade unions were worried about the impact on workers. So they like organized this campaign, got this cross-party coalition, and it was actually one of the Cameron government's only defeats in the House of Commons, which I was involved in, which is pretty cool. One thing my think tank is now looking at is whether we should relax Sunday trading laws to help economic growth. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that we should. I don't think it's like a massive game changer, but like on balance, I think probably that was like not a great thing to push for. I don't think it's like evil or anything, but yeah, definitely made mistakes and changed my mind on things. I think one thing that's hard in politics is that because everything is so public and visible, even if you're not a politician, like everything we do as a think tank or everything organizations push for is public. U-turns are really penalized by voters. Like the media and the voters really don't like it when people change their mind. And I'd love to have a culture where that was more acceptable, where it wasn't seen as like a mark of treachery or disloyalty to a cause, but more just, hey, I've looked at the evidence and I've changed my mind, and I come across better arguments, or maybe the evidence has changed. But we don't, I'm not sure how to like inculcate that culture, but I'd love to see more of that in politics.
In the example you've just provided, we've seen how there's the potential for faith and policy to combine and influence our ideas. What would you say are the spiritual risks and rewards of working in policy? How have you found that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because it's much easier to identify the risks. Like politics is, I guess some of the stereotypes that we all hear from the outside that the media talks about, some of those stereotypes are true. Like it can be quite a cutthroat, nasty environment. I think there aren't, one of the things I like about politics is that it's not a big bureaucracy and politics compared to civil service. And that also means that there aren't loads of like rules or like codes of practice in place, which means you can have a lot of autonomy and get a lot done. I think the flip side of that is that it can like allow lots of like nasty or inappropriate behavior. It can be quite bitchy. People can just like be a bit nasty and gossipy, and it's kind of hard not to like sink into that on some level. I think also like politics gives you a huge opportunity to love your enemies because it gives you enemies. Like it literally says you're fighting for this thing and these people are fighting against you, or you're standing in, as a candidate and other people are standing against you. So it's like intrinsically adversarial, at least the way we do it in the UK. It's like super adversarial. I don't think that's always a bad thing, but I think it can it's like a risk, right? It's like it can veer into, rather than just I disagree with this person, it's like I hate them and I need them to lose, which is definitely what the system encourages. It's a really good question on like what are the actual rewards. Like I do think so. Like in terms of the personal rewards, obviously I think the biggest reward is like you just get to have this enormous impact, and I think that's like a good enough reason to do it in itself. But if you're thinking about spiritual rewards in terms of like how it personally affects me or an individual in the system, I guess it like forces you to really engage critically with what you actually believe. So you're in the space of ideas and ideologies, and there will be issues like the assisted dying vote, which is going on right now, where a lot of Christians would have a different perspective, and that's like they kind of have to stand up and be like, hey, I'm a Christian, I have a different view, which maybe you don't need to do in lots of kinds of workplaces. So it forces you to think about right and wrong more. I think it forces you to like encounter and work with a huge variety of people. Like if I'd got a job in, I don't know, consultancy or tech or something, like I probably wouldn't meet people with like vastly different backgrounds and points of view. And like Westminster could definitely be a lot more diverse, but I think it's actually pretty diverse compared to like lots of other workplaces that middle class graduates go into. And I think, especially in terms of like worldview diversity, right? Like I think it forces you to engage with that. I think maybe the public nature can be helpful. Like on the one hand, the media is like a bit of a shit show and there's like constant like mudslinging and stuff. But on the other hand, I think actually being forced to be public and accountable for your actions, there's something healthy to that as well. And maybe that would be harder in some other professions. Not thought about it loads, you can probably tell, but those are some initial thoughts.
You mentioned one of the major challenges there is maintaining Christ-like virtues, but generally thinking more broadly about the most encouraging and most difficult aspects of your career, what advice would you give to someone that's interested in policy, perhaps pivoting into it, or that's what they're pursuing?
Do you mean like career advice, or do you mean specifically for dealing with like the challenges?
Career advice.
Oh, career advice, okay, cool. Yeah, that's easier. It's probably fairly standard stuff, but I'll say it anyway, which is like, give it a go. I think there are probably some relatively, I don't want to make it sound too easy, but like relatively low cost ways of getting involved in politics or policy on some level. And that will like probably quite quickly give you a sense of whether or not this is a good fit. And there are also options that I think retain quite a lot of option value. So I think working in Parliament, if you are thinking about politics, is a really good option because it looks kind of cool on your CV. Everyone knows what Parliament is. So if you do completely decide to do something else, I don't think it matters much. I think it's a great thing to have on your CV. And it will just very quickly expose you to pretty much all the people who work in politics in some way. Like you'll interact with journalists and staffers and sometimes civil servants and ministers and so on. So I think that's super useful. Similarly, like working as a junior civil servant, like there's a fairly standard way to do that in the UK. Like there's just a website, you apply for civil service jobs, there's the fast stream program. That feels like a relatively easy way to get quick experience of whether or not civil service is right for you. I think I also wouldn't, I think they're probably also not too much of like, they're not in too much tension at an early career stage. So I think I know some really good people in Labour and think tank world who were civil servants initially. I don't think that's a massive issue. I think the only thing I wouldn't do is like, you know, campaign really loudly for some controversial cause if you want to retain the option of either going into the civil service or going into one of the mainstream parties in the future. Yeah, and like talk to people. You know, this network's really cool. I kind of wish something like this existed when I was leaving university.
It's been lovely hearing about your experience, and hopefully we can all learn or take something away from it. We'll now open up to questions on Slido, and then we'll also take some hands. One of the questions is, how do you stay non-party affiliated, and does that affect your professional interactions?
So I'm not non-party affiliated. I'm a Labour member and I ran as a Labour candidate. So yeah, and that's kind of public. Yeah, I don't manage to do that. My think tank is officially non-partisan, so we're a registered charity in the UK, so we have to be. I think there is a general understanding in the Charity Commission that like a lot of people who work in think tanks will be personally affiliated to political parties, but there's just got to be some like guardrails in place to make sure that organisationally we're not affiliated with any one particular party. But even then it's tricky because ultimately, in order to, like what we care about is influencing policy, not like our ultimate aim isn't to like sit there being as non-partisan as possible, right? It's to like actually change policy. And so our engagement with policymakers is really important, and the guys who are currently in charge are Labour, and you know, after the next election it might be a different lot. And so we do need to be realistic about the way we frame things. It's got to sort of line up with what this government cares about. And then when we're meeting with individuals, we obviously don't want to give the sense that we're like not on side in some way. So it's a tricky line to tread. I think all think tanks, or all the ones that are also charities, which is quite a lot of them, like find it a bit tricky, and like some manage it better than others. So Policy Exchange, which is a conservative think tank, is like currently under investigation by the Charity Commission for being too conservative. And they obviously are, so everyone kind of knows that in Westminster, whereas I think others like manage to tread the line better. What I would say is that, yeah, I don't think, I don't know if this is the question behind the question, but I don't think you should be afraid of the party system. So an analogy which someone who used to run like Christians on the left used was, if you were picking a church, like you wouldn't say, hey, like I'm not going to go to this church because there are these people I disagree with in it, or because like the pastor once said this thing that I don't align with, or the archbishop once said this thing which I don't agree with. Like we see it as important as Christians to be part of a church, part of a community, and that's both personally enriching for us and for our spiritual lives, but it's also like part of the way in which we have an impact in the world. And we do exist in a political system where certain jobs just require you to engage with those political parties, and no institution is perfect, no political party is perfect. There is no one who perfectly aligns with the Labour Party on every single issue. Or as, you know, I could say like, there is one party in the world which I completely agree with, and that's the David Lawrence Party, and it only has one member, and sadly that member is me. And whereas the Labour Party is like the place where I feel the most common ground with other people, but of course I disagree with stuff they do, like every Labour member does, but that doesn't mean it's not worth engaging.
I'm glad we were able to clear that misconception up. Another question we have is, I'll try and project.
This on a quick fix, we'll just have a couple out, sorry.
How did you pivot from parliamentary assistant to establishing expertise as an advisor?
As running a think tank? Or,
yes,
yeah,
frame it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's like a fairly standard route in some ways. Like I think a lot of people who set up think tanks have probably been involved with the political system in some way. I think yeah, working in Parliament, as I said, gives you really good exposure to a huge range of different people who work in the system. You'll understand the processes and like how change happens. So I think in many ways you're quite well placed to set up a new organisation in that space. In terms of what I specifically did, so I worked in Parliament for a bit, then I became a lobbyist basically for a charity that's working on international trade. Super useful experience, maybe not like the cause area that I'm most excited about. And then I worked at Chatham House, which is the UK's largest think tank focused on international policy. And again, really good experience, like definitely gave me some like more credibility having worked at a big think tank. Probably not, again, like the issues or the cause areas I'm most excited about. But I think having had that experience, I felt a little bit better placed to pivot and set up something which was like both a think tank and focused on issues which I think are really important. A really key thing was meeting a team of other people who were willing to do it with me. So my co-founder, Julia, who I met a couple of years ago and like have the same vision, but also like funders and board members who are like willing to back us. So it's definitely not like something you can just go out and do on your own. Like you kind of need to find people around you. But when you do have people around you, it's amazingly like wonderful. I genuinely think there's nothing more life-giving and joyful in the world than just finding a team of people who agree with you and like pushing at the same mission together. We don't agree on everything, but we're pushing at the same mission together, and that's really, really rewarding.
I don't know if you're at the workshop yesterday, but we spoke a lot about career capital, and we've just seen how career capital, but also building community through events like this has led to where you are now. Does anybody have any questions here that we could, yes?
I was curious how adversarial the work of your think tank is in the sense of like, are you just informing politicians, or do you feel like you have to be competing with other think tanks or advocacy groups to get your point of view across in Senate affairs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd say in general it doesn't feel like we're competing with other think tanks. I think partly because we're looking at issues and from a perspective which is a bit of a niche, which other think tanks aren't looking at. There are maybe one or two areas where we're publishing in similar areas, but I think on those, the other think tanks are like so pleased to have another think tank that's like also looking at that issue that it tends to actually be more collaborative. So we did something recently on like reforming stamp duty and like land taxes in the UK, and there are several other think tanks that have looked at that, but they were just like, hey, there's like more people making the noise about this, and so I think the think tank world is a lot more collaborative than I think Parliament is more collaborative than people think. I think the think tank world is more collaborative than even that. So, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Oh, is this working again?
We'll next go for a question on basically how you manage to balance all of your work life with rest and replenishment. So a more wholesome question.
I don't think I do really. This might be the most controversial thing I'd say. I think like rest might be slightly overrated. Like, I know the thing you're meant to say is that you need to have like really like balanced lifestyle, but I just feel like probably the most impactful people in the world probably don't get loads of rest and are probably just working really hard at the thing they're working at. I mean, I think what is really key is that it's something you love. Like, I think that's absolutely essential. So I think if you're forcing yourself to get out of bed and work and it's like a massive grind, you're probably just in the wrong job. So I don't think the solution there is to rest more. I think it's just to get a different job. But I think if you're in a job that you love and it's like, which is the kind of job you should be in, because that's where you're going to have the biggest impact. But I think you're going to want to work quite hard at it. And yeah, I'm sure there's like personality stuff going on. I've got ADHD, so I find it like quite hard to switch off. But I think I've definitely found it more helpful to just be forgiving of myself for like working really hard at something and then, you know, taking time off when I want to, rather than like trying to like build in really regular rhythms, which I know is controversial, but that's kind of my view.
You mentioned there about doing something you love. Did it take a while to find the thing you liked, or have you always just known?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So that applies to my current job because I really like it. In my other jobs, I would do a lot of like, I wouldn't do those jobs very well. And instead I would do a lot of like side projects, like helping set up this organization because I really love that. So yeah, maybe I'm being a little bit too facetious. I think it does depend on the role you're in and the career stage you're at. But I think you want to get to a place where you can be in a job that you just genuinely like gives you loads of energy and isn't like super draining, and like ideally find side projects that can do that as well.
Yes. Okay.
I'm interested in your reflections about being a policy generalist and potentially covering lots of different areas over the course of a career or flitting between things, compared to specialising really hard on one problem area and going super deep. What do you think are the trade-offs between different approaches, and how have you made decisions whether to specialise or to be a generalist?
Yeah, I think if you're in politics, you probably are better off being a bit of a generalist, because politicians have to just engage with such a wide range of policy issues. And it feels like maybe a bit risky to like double down on this is my thing as an MP. I think having some areas, like broad areas of interest is helpful. Like if you want to, try and become the international development minister, then like you want to be like have some demonstrable like this is the stuff I've done in international development. But I wouldn't like put all your eggs in that basket. Civil service is probably a bit different, although even then I feel like generalists tend to be the ones that like climb the most. So you would know better, Alex, about whether that's like a good strategy in the civil service. So in my think tank, like we rely very heavily on a few like specialists, and they're like it's really important to have those. So there is definitely a role for them, but like yeah, in general, I think the generalists are probably the ones who will get like more senior roles or do the more impactful stuff. But it's not a really strong view. So don't go away and like give up your specialism just for that.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Thanks for your speech so far. I'm curious about, and I think there's another question related to that. I'm curious about what your advice is when it comes to how the lenses through which people view policies and political issues. For instance, you're liberal, you're conservative, etc. What's the trade-off? Should people be looking at things along ideological or party lines alone, or should it be like case-by-case basis or issue-based, etc.? What's your advice to that?
Yeah, really, really good question. And there'll be a huge variety of views on that. And I don't know if I'm the best placed person to judge. But my general instinct is that ideologies, like we should be really suspicious of ideologies, I think. Maybe like especially as Christians. But probably on any worldview, like I think if what an ideology is like ascribing to a certain view of the world and certain values, which you're willing to like trade off against evidence, and that might be like scientific evidence, or it might be just like what you hear other people saying, or your like experience of the real world. I think that is suspect. Maybe I'm saying this because I grew up in like communist China and I like saw the more disastrous impacts of ideology in some places. I think the reason why I still think party political engagement is important isn't because I think the ideologies are necessarily like correct or that ideology is important, but more that I think community and groups of people are really important. And I think ideology does play this role, annoyingly, of like gathering people and being the thing that people like, they believe in the same thing and they want to like push towards it, and they want to it makes people want to change the world, which I think can be really positive. So my reason for party political engagement is more like communities and groups of people are important rather than ideologies. And I think if we can push political parties to be a little bit less ideological and a little bit more evidence-led while retaining the benefits of like we're like in the same network pushing towards the same thing, I think that's really helpful.
How do you balance that with your faith? How does your faith then inform?
So again, this might be another controversial thing I say. I don't know if my faith does massively inform my like the way I look at the world and evidence. It probably does in like a very background sense of like the values that I grew up with and are instilled in me, and the values that like I think also inherit from like the Western liberal tradition are like really informed by Christianity. So in that sense, I think faith is hugely important. But I don't know if I go into like individual issues day to day and think like, hey, what's the Christian perspective on this? And I don't know if that's the right thing to do. I'm like open to challenge on this, but I think there's huge areas of life where we wouldn't expect there to be like a Christian perspective on X. So like, Paul was a tent maker. Like, he probably didn't think, for all his like theologizing, that there was like a Christian view of tent making. But for some reason, when it comes to policy, we assume like, hey, there must be like a Christian take on like homelessness or a Christian like approach to housing or something. And maybe there is. Maybe there's like some special issues which God has carved out, or that we think intersect a lot with like Christian values more than others. But I'm in general a little bit suspicious of that. Like, I think in most areas of policy making, we should just be like really careful to look at the evidence and like think carefully about what we should be trying to achieve and like how we balance that with different interests. I don't think you need to be a Christian to do that well. And in fact, there are lots of Christians who don't do it well, and there are lots of non-Christians who do it extremely well.
Any other? Yes.
I'm really interested in the intersection between health and entrepreneurship, especially within the UK. And from what we're saying, I guess I'm going to go back and think, okay, if anything that I want to build needs to align with whatever is happening in terms of policy. And do you know of any like think tanks that basically focus on those kind of challenges, or any policy documents that I should be aware of that could help inform like what we do?
Let me have a think about, maybe let's chat after and I can have a proper think about groups. I do think there's a bit of a gap. Like, there are some really big health think tanks in the UK, but they tend not to be, in my experience, they tend not to be looking at like the more innovative end of health. And it's more like, like more classic, like how does the NHS do procurement or whatever, which is important, but maybe not quite what you're describing. So yeah, let's chat separately.
Another highly rated question on the Slido is, you're aware of the think tank space. Are there any Christian specific think tanks?
There are. So there's one called Theos, which I interned with. I don't know if they're actually explicitly Christian. They share an office with the Bible Society, so I'm pretty sure they are. But they're looking at religion in public life. So if you're interested in not just like, working with other Christians, but also working on that specific issue of like, how does Christianity intersect with public life? They produce some really interesting research. And then there are several think tanks that I think were founded by Christians or founded with some sort of Christian ethos. So the Centre for Social Justice, I think, would be an example of this, which is sort of like a centre-right social policy think tank, which Ian Duncan Smith founded. And then Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I think, would also probably be in that category. I think probably it's a good thing that we don't have like too much explicit, like, this is the Christian view on this policy, and we're the think tank which has taken that forward. Like, I think I like that in the UK there are Christians in pretty much all major political parties, and that it's not assumed that, if you're a Christian you must be Conservative or Labour or whatever, in a way that it is in, say, the US, where I think it's like religion and public life have blended in a like particularly depressing way. And whatever your views are, you can probably agree with that statement.
Is there anything you can say to encourage people before they go, just so we don't end on that note? I mean, I'm always encouraged by this community, and as I said earlier, I just wish that something like this existed when I was at university. I'm so glad it does now. I think Christians who are like thinking super carefully about how they can have an impact in the world is just awesome. Like that is literally how the world gets changed. And then maybe just one personal reflection is, I know people in this room who helped set up Just Love. I know people in this room who helped set up this organization. I've been involved with setting up a think tank. And I guess my main takeaway from that is that, and it's become a bit of a meme, but you can just do things. Like, there are no rules against setting up the kinds of organization or movement that you want to see in the world. Quite often, it's easier to set up a new thing than to try and reform an existing thing. There are loads and loads of examples of that. It's how things work in the marketplace. I think we assume that for some reason that isn't how things might work in the church or in the charity sector or in politics, but I think it often is. Often you just need a group of individuals who really believe something, who set something up, and that is genuinely how the world gets changed. So I think we should all be hopeful about that. Thank you for sharing your experience today, and we'll just end with knowing that we should just do things. And thank you.
Thank you.